Hi, it's Penny here, and we are getting into the spooky season now, so I thought I would use it as an excuse to talk about some of the scariest books that I've read. Now, I do want to acknowledge that here in the Southern Hemisphere, it's currently spring. However, because every spring, everyone in the Northern Hemisphere is talking about fall and spooky stuff, I feel like I've come to associate spring with spooky stuff. So yes, we have a lot of beautiful flowers outside, but also I don't see why that can't also be scary. I mean, have you seen Alice in Wonderland? Those flowers are scary, right? Anyway, I have a list of 10 books. We're going to start with the least scary and move through to the most scary. And if you know my bookshelves, there's a bit of a gap here, which is in fact the two at the top of the list. But firstly, I am going to start with it's almost an honorary mention, even though I've made it number 10, because this is a book that I loved when I was a kid. And I actually used to like reading scary books when I was a kid. So there were a lot of like point thrillers and Christopher Pike books that I could have included in this list that I'm not. But what I am going to include is The Fog by Caroline B. Cooney. So this is a story about this young girl and all the young people or teenagers on the island where she lives basically will go and board on the mainland while they go to school. So Christina, the main character, this is her first year going to the mainland. But when they get there, there's strange things happening in the house where they're staying. And it's kind of awful because a lot of the time Christina is observing things or thinking things and nobody believes her. And she comes from the island with this idea that she's such a strong person and that the island gives her strength. And then when she's separated from all of that, she really is almost made to believe that she can't hack it. But there's some crazy things going on. I really love that series. They are really short books, targeted at more like young teenagers. But if you want to be creeped out, I still think these are really great ones. Then at number 9 is We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson. So this is about these two sisters who live in their old family home in this isolated village. And right from the start, everyone in the village is treating this young girl when she goes shopping, treating her really strangely. And you learn that it's because everyone else in their family died from poisoning. And as you go through the story, you kind of learn who might have been responsible for that poisoning and like learn more about the family. But actually the part that sticks in my mind as being more terrifying is that this cousin of theirs turns up and doesn't want to leave. And Shirley Jackson is just great at like these really dark vibes, and the main character, Mary Cat, is a really strange girl with some darker interests. Then at number 8, we have Flight of the Fantail by Steph Mataku, who is a New Zealand author. And this is a story about these teenagers. So it is a YA horror, I guess. But basically these teenagers are on a school trip and then their bus crashes and they end up stranded in the middle of nowhere in New Zealand, like in the middle of the bush. And then the survivors are kind of slowly coming together and some weird things start happening to them that they really don't understand what's happening. I think just the concept of being in the middle of the bush, like so far away from any help, and then weird things are happening is absolutely terrifying. But the way Steph Mataku describes things, I really love Steph Mataku's writing. And this book does go in some really weird directions at the end that I don't know how I feel about, but it was definitely terrifying. Then number 7 is a graphic novel, and that is The Night Eaters by Marjorie Liu and Sana Takeda. So Marjorie Liu and Sana Takeda are the creators of the Monstrous series, which I also really recommend. But in The Night Eaters, it's kind of set during COVID, and we have these young adults who've been trying to run a restaurant, but obviously that's not a great time to be doing anything like that. And their parents have come, I always forget, from China, Hong Kong, Hawaii, perhaps all of the above, depending on how you look at things. Anyway, their parents have come to help, and while their father is actually pretty supportive, their mother is fairly disappointed in them. She doesn't think that they are tough enough, so she decides that they are going to need to help her out with this haunted house across the road from where they live, because you also get the backstory of the parents and how they met and learn that there's a lot more to the family. And there are some horrible serial killer things going on as well, some spooky dolls, and the drawing style, even though it's very different from Monstrous, I love the beautiful art. Night Eaters is a lot rougher, but I think it really suits that spooky atmosphere, and some pages are just horrific. Then at number 6, we have The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle by Haruki Murakami. So I've read a few things by Haruki Murakami, and I think all of them you could say are horrifying, but not always in a good way. And I'm always unsure whether The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle was actually better, or whether because it was the first thing I read by Haruki Murakami, I just liked it better because I wasn't aware of some of the things he always does that end up really frustrating me, like his inappropriate sex and his obsession with periods. But putting all of that aside, The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle, we're following this man who has decided that he's going to quit his job and spend some time like figuring out what he wants to do with himself. His wife keeps ringing him and being like, have you seen the cat? And it seems like her family is quite strange. There's also a strange neighbor, and just generally a lot of strange things going on. It's a very long book that meanders around at times into different topics. One part though that I particularly remember is when he finds this well in his backyard or something and just goes down and sits in the dark and then has these experiences that you're never sure, like, are they real or not? And just the whole thing is really dark and creepy, and the idea, like the amount that it goes into of just sitting in the darkness, but also so many other parts of the story as well are so creepy and horrifying and scary. So personally, I don't necessarily recommend Haruki Murakami, but I think if you're going to read something by him, then The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle is the one that I would recommend. Then at number 5, we have Bird Box by Josh Malerman. So in this one, basically weird things start happening in the world where people will just suddenly turn really violent. And it turns out it's something like when people see something, maybe, that it will just like turn them into these violent people. And so the people who are surviving are people who are locking themselves inside and covering all the windows. And anytime they go out into the world, they will cover up their eyes so that there's no chance of them seeing whatever it is that's turning people into these horrible, violent monsters. And the book itself is actually told in 2 timelines. So one, when this thing is first starting to happen and we're following this young woman. Is she pregnant right from the start? I think she is. And basically how she does manage to find shelter in this house with these other people and the drama that's happening in the house. But also then another timeline where she has these 2 young children with her and she's taking them in a boat to try and get somewhere where they think they're going to be safe. But they're doing that whole thing like getting in a boat and going down the river while blindfolded. Now I am somewhat scared of the dark. Also, I don't swim very good. So that whole concept of like trying to travel somewhere without being able to see and also being surrounded by water, awful. I will also mention the sequel. What was it called? Mallory. I know some people didn't like it because it gives you a few too many answers. The Bird Box, the original one, still leaves a lot of questions around what is really happening to people. Whereas Mallory actually gives you a few more answers, and some people didn't like that. But I actually quite liked Mallory as well. Oh, and if you don't want to try the book, then there's also a Netflix adaptation with Sandra Bullock in it, which I think is where most people would know this book from. Then at number 4, we have another graphic novel series, and that is the Lock and Key series by Joe Hill and Gabriel Rodriguez. So this is a story about this family. A very traumatic thing happens to them and the family ends up moving back to their father's old family house, which is called the Key House. And hidden throughout this house is a whole bunch of magical keys. So while they're there trying to deal with the trauma of their life, they start finding these magical keys, but there's also another person, creature. There's other people who are out to try and get these keys so that they can have the powers. And there's also a lot of mystery and secrets around where these keys came from. And this one, I would say it's sometimes a lot of fun, but also like kind of deliciously scary at times. Then at number 3, we have Into the Mist by Lee Murray. This is another New Zealand author. And this is actually a military creature horror, which isn't something I ever would have thought I would like. However, I picked it up. because it is set in New Zealand. Once again, in the middle of the bush, in the middle of nowhere. I think maybe just because I've spent time in the middle of the bush, in the middle of nowhere in New Zealand, I can imagine how quickly things could go terribly wrong in that situation. So this is actually a series as well, but in the first book, we have a bunch of different people in this forest for different reasons. So we have some of the locals who have an idea that something's going wrong. We have some Department of Conservation, like environmentalists there looking into, I think, a snail or something. I've forgotten now, but they're there for environmental reasons. We also have some criminals who are there doing some not great things, like some poaching or something. I've kind of forgotten the details. And also some military there, I think, trying to track down the criminals. So all these different people come together, and there is some kind of creature in the forest that then makes it very unsafe for everyone. And these books are super action-packed. Like, I wish these would be made into action movies. I think they could be amazing. But honestly, usually I would say action-packed stories are not to my taste, but this one I was so invested in everything that was happening. I think as well as being a lot of action, there's some interesting incorporation of Maori mythology, and also just like really good character development, and almost like a little bit of a romance as well. Like, it kind of just has everything. And once I started reading it, I just didn't want to stop because I was so like scared and worried about what was going to happen. Okay, then we're down to the top two. Firstly, for number two, we have Someone Like Me by Emma Carey. So this follows a woman who is a victim of domestic abuse, so trigger warnings for that. But one day, while an altercation is happening, she feels like she loses control of herself with some quite extreme consequences. And afterwards, she's left kind of asking herself, was that me or not? Because that didn't seem like me. As well, her son is friends with this other girl who was kidnapped when she was younger, and as a result has some like quite severe mental illness. And strange things are happening to her as well, although she's never sure, is it all just in her head? And kind of their stories end up coming together in a way that was just so satisfying. But once again, I didn't want to stop reading it because I just was so worried for these characters, and some of the ideas in here are terrifying. Like, if this happened, like I'm reading on the back of the book here, it says, and when her alter ego takes control, the consequences are devastating. Devastating. Then lastly, we have Uzumaki by Junji Ito. So actually a lot of things by Junji Ito are very terrifying, but Uzumaki is my favorite. And I'm not alone in this one, for sure. But I guess the interesting thing about this one is the scary thing is spirals. And you might think, how could spirals be scary? But slowly throughout this book, Junji Ito just like takes the concept of spirals and like escalates and escalates. It always makes sense the way that it builds on itself. But in the end, just the things that are happening are so awful. And it's not always just the spirals, it's also the way that the people in this story are reacting to the spirals. And I just love how this builds and builds and builds and becomes such like an overwhelming, horrible thing where if you see a spiral, you're like, no, help me. Anyway, if you want to be terrified of spirals, this is the book. So I'm pretty sure those are the scariest books that I have ever read, although maybe I'm forgetting some. Let me know what the scariest books you have read are, because I would love some recommendations for this spooky season. And do subscribe if you'd like to see more of my bookish videos. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. I hope that you are doing well, and I will see you next time.